passage. Over coffee, Aaron said something that was profound, and I know his church back in the day was, I think, 50% African American. So could you just repeat the short version of the connection between this catastrophe?
Yeah. So whenever I would talk about Israel, our church was 50% African American. Our African American, families would come up and say, what about our story? And so I started studying story of slavery, the Middle Passage, and the word Mafa, which is Swahili for great disaster, which has the same meaning as Holocaust. And so as I studied the great disaster, there's 12 million people brought across the Middle Passage. 2 million were thrown into the sea because they would run out of water. I mean, just think about that. So the Africans, hundreds of years of slavery, they learned Psalm 130, which is out of the depths we cry to you, which is the depths of the Middle Passage, the depths of the sea we cry to you. Hear our prayer, and then the rest of the psalm is about Israel. And so they felt this connection to Israel, and the day that they were emancipated after hundreds of years of waiting, they lit candles all to the West Indies and waited. The scripture says they waited for the morning as the watchman waits for the morning. They repeated it twice. So they lit candles and they waited for the morning, but they had this great identification with Israel. So I just think there needs to be maybe we solve this whole issue by sharing our stories together, and maybe there's collaboration between us.
That's what Fred Mars also means, grievous wound.
Yes.
Which is,
Ongoing, yeah. So we have tragically things in our painful past that are connected, and common things in our quest for liberation that are somehow connected as well. So lots to learn from each other and hear each other. So on this note, and in this spirit, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce David. Today, Gillette will be interviewing him. No, I'm kidding. So David,
revenge.
So David is, as you know, the vice president or the vice chair of ISGAP. He joined us about 6 months ago or so, and really brought ISGAP to a new level and added a whole new dimension to what we're doing. And as I said earlier, David was the head of the American Jewish Committee, or the AJC, which is one of the preeminent Jewish organizations based in the United States, but with a global reach. I think Shimon Peres and others have said that David was the quintessential or the most important Jewish ambassador in the world, and is highly respected around the world in the Jewish community and well beyond. So David, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Some time ago in the New York Times, there was an article about someone who had just passed away, and it recounted an episode on the eve of his death, when the family gathered around his bedside in the hospital, knowing that these were his last moments, and they said to him, "Papa, would you rather be buried or cremated?" And he paused for a moment and he summoned some energy and he said, "Why don't you surprise me?" I was supposed to speak tomorrow. So this is not a choice between a burial and a cremation, but this is somewhat spontaneous. At least I don't think it is. So this is somewhat spontaneous. Charles asked me earlier this morning, and I can't say no to Charles. I think most of us can't. So here I am with no PowerPoint, so it's just me.
and that's all right.
And I'm, although I studied in this city a few years before Carlton, you and Charles did, I have no aspirations today to be a scholar, nor any pretensions. And rather, I think very much in the spirit of what I've been hearing and the conversation that you heard yesterday from my wife, I want to speak to you very much from the heart. And I hope you'll permit me to do so. I'm the first person in my entire extended family born in the United States. My mother was born in Russia. Together with her family, they were among the very lucky and few to be able to leave the Soviet Union during the Stalin regime. As Jews, they saw no future. And like many both Jews and non-Jews who were able to flee communism, they went to Paris. And some of you may have heard the stories of members of the Romanov family driving taxis or becoming waiters. That was the non-Jewish side of the equation. And the Jewish side of the equation was also new language, new culture, no help. We start from scratch and we're grateful. And that continued from 1929 to 1940. And then, as you know, in May 1940, Nazi Germany attacked France. And what was thought to be the invulnerable Maginot Line that France had built to repel a possible German invasion proved to be completely useless, largely because the Germans were smart enough to go around the Maginot Line and, as in World War I, go through Belgium and then come south. And so once again, my mother and her family were on the move. David without a dwelling place. Many Jews, some non-Jews, some mixed marriages, moved south, trying to escape both Nazi Germany and the French collaboration under Vichy, which emerged as a key partner. And for 17 months, my mother and her family were in hiding, in fear, because no country was willing at the time to offer a dwelling place to my family. In fact, just 2 years before, in 1938, at the encouragement of the Roosevelt administration, an administration that was iconic for American Jews who had overwhelmingly voted for that administration in 1932 and 1936, and again subsequently in 1940 and 44, there was a conference held in a place that you may know more for its water than for its history, Evian. 32 countries gathered in Evian, France, 85 years ago last month, with the alleged purpose of addressing the refugee issue created by Hitler. Of the 32 countries, 31, including the United States, refused to offer a dwelling place to the Jewish refugees. The only country, may surprise some of you simply because it's not on your radar screen in this conversation, the only country was the Dominican Republic. And for those of you who may have occasion to go there, there is a town, Sosua, which to this day still has a legacy of the German and other Jews who improbably settled there. And when I say improbably, with enormous gratitude, but having expected that the United States or other larger countries would open their doors, would not. But at the end of the day, my mother and 13 other relatives were fortunate, thanks to a congressman in northeastern Pennsylvania that they never met, a Republican, Ivor Fenton, lobbied for them. They got the visas, and only because they got the visas were they able to cross the border to neutral Spain under Franco, the fascist, and then to cross the border to Portugal. Now back to movie references for a moment, and Humphrey Bogart. How many of you have seen Casablanca? Well, the central theme of Casablanca, other than Humphrey Bogart's personality, is actually a city, Lisbon. The goal of everyone in Rick's Cafe was not simply to order a scotch or a coffee, it was to figure out how to get to Lisbon, neutral Lisbon, and from Lisbon to cross the ocean, which my mother and her family were able to do on the eve of Pearl Harbor. For them, therefore, America represented something much bigger than many others can understand. It became their dwelling place. In effect, it became their Zion. America, whose founders had visualized the New Jerusalem, the city on the hill, even if it had turned its back on so many other Jews, had allowed them in, and their response was everlasting gratitude. And by the way, one other fact to underscore just how lucky they were. Beginning in 1924, America introduced highly restrictive, one might say highly racist, immigration quotas, which not only favored whites, that wasn't even the point. It was a given that it was essentially a white immigration policy. It favored Northern and Western European whites, Anglo-Saxon whites, Scandinavian whites, and not the riffraff of Eastern Europe and those Jews, or Southern Europe and those Catholics. Even with the restrictive immigration quotas in the United States, including for Germany and Austria, in the 10-year period leading up to the Second World War, the United States only fulfilled the quota for Germany once in 10 years. And not for lack of applications. There were hundreds of thousands, but they came from Jews largely. And the administration was not ready to take the Jews. This is not a debate about whether Franklin Roosevelt was an anti-Semite or not, but he was a politician, certainly. And there was no political capital whatsoever in allowing the Jews in. None. And so the United States did not, even in the limited numbers except once. And by the way, even further to underscore the point of where Jews found themselves, in the 1936 Summer Olympic Games, the Olympics made famous by Jesse Owens, and I believe his 4 gold medals. He was not supposed to run in the 4x100 relay. 2 Jews were, one of whom became a family friend, Marty Glickman. Marty Glickman, a close family friend of my aunt's, and I met him and his wife on many, many occasions before he passed away. And the United States Olympic Committee agreed to remove those 2 athletes who had prepared for years and qualified in order not to ruffle the feathers of the Hitler regime. That was, in a way, the state of the Jews, and why my mother every day said, "Thank you, America." And when people said to my mother, "Do you miss Europe?" her response essentially was, "I wish it were farther away today." My father was born in Hungary, but grew up in Austria, the last legs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1938, Nazi Germany, depending on how you read and write the history, invaded Austria, annexed Austria, liberated Austria.
Liberated.
Take your pick depending on the Austrians you speak with. And shortly after the Nazis seized Austria, and by the way, let's remember that Adolf Hitler himself was Austrian. My father was expelled from his university studies for only one reason. Professors in the room, not because he plagiarized or missed an assignment, but because he was a Jew. And instead, like other Jews, his new job was to shine the boots of Nazi officers while on his knees on the concrete sidewalks of Vienna, Austria. Once, together with Germany, perhaps the most educated cosmopolitan place on earth. My father refused to become a victim. My father was a fighter. And he escaped Austria and arrived in France, where by chance, in passing, he met his future wife, my mother. But that's not the story. The French, yes, gave him a dwelling place, but on the other hand, drafted him, and instead of sending him to the French army, very deliberately chose to send him to the notorious French Foreign Legion, which was largely a bastion of criminals, crooks, ruffians, and anti-Semites. And after France fell to Vichy in June of 1940, my father was arrested by Vichy and sent to a labor camp in western Algeria, where the prisoners worked in the coal mines. I can only begin to imagine, or probably can't begin to imagine, what it would have been like to be a slave laborer working in coal mines near the Sahara Desert. Imagine the level of heat and intensity, not to mention the near-starvation diet. But again, my father was a fighter, and on his second attempt, he escaped. And with the help, Jalal, of Berbers that he met perchance, they helped him cross 600 miles of desert to Algiers, where my father was quickly recruited by OSS, the wartime espionage agency, and sent behind enemy lines because he was a fighter and they smelled it, and stayed behind enemy lines in Austria and Yugoslavia until the end of the war. And OSS brought my father to the United States because he was a fighter. And like my mother, though they didn't meet again until a bit later, my father was eternally grateful to the United States. Not only for winning the war together with allies, but for giving him a new dwelling place, which, like so many other Jews, again back to David's point earlier, Jews believed was going to be the exception to the diaspora experience of other Jewish communities and become, yes, as I said a few moments ago, their permanent home, their everlasting Zion, that shining city on the hill. That's the family I come from. They weren't religious, but I was an only child. And here I enter only briefly out of fear into the territory of Larry, because Larry is the expert on the subject and I'm only an exhibit in the subject. And because I was an only child and both of my parents were survivors and others in the family had their own stories, I felt I had to be the perfect child. I couldn't, as I came to learn, not because my parents shoved it down my throat, they didn't. They didn't want to wallow in victimhood, to quote my wife from yesterday. They wanted to look ahead, not back. They wanted to be like good drivers. Occasionally you look in the rearview mirror, but if you take your eyes off the front, you're going to have trouble. They wanted to look ahead. But you know, children are a lot smarter than parents often give them credit for. And children can intuit things. Something wasn't quite right in the family in which I grew up. On a very simple level, why do they all have these stories? I mean, other kids had stories of parents who grew up and went to summer camp in Maine and played in color war, as they called it, the red team versus the gray team, and these were their childhood memories. And yet when I heard references to camp, I had already become old enough to know that there were other camps where it wasn't about color war, it was about genocidal war. And why couldn't my parents speak one language fluently? I grew up in a home, and it was only when my friends came over that they pointed it out to me, where sentences were never completed in one language, because there was always a better word in another language, or there was a missing word in their own vocabulary. Because my mother had left Russia by the age of 6, so she never learned to read and write Russian. Her Russian was fluent, but primitively fluent. She moved to France, but was not allowed by the Nazis to finish high school, because she never got her baccalaureate, much less college. And my parents had no common language. My father's native language was German, and my mother's was Russian. So they spoke French. So I grew up in a home where they spoke French imperfectly, while my mother spoke Russian to her parents next door, and my father spoke the dreaded language German, which he otherwise would not want to speak, but with his parents it was instinctive. And I knew that there was something wrong here. Lives were cut short, lives were disrupted, certain names were mentioned with reverence until I discovered that they had passed away. Passed away, what am I saying? They were annihilated. They were murdered for one simple reason. They were Jews. And yet I couldn't even grasp in this home, which was non-religious, what was it about being Jewish? I didn't see any difference. My family did not keep kosher. I actually did not experience my first Shabbat dinner until after graduate school. After living in this country. We did not have a mezuzah on the door. So what was it? What distinguished us? What prompted this? And then I began to read. And the first book I read was a book that has stayed with me to this day. And it was the first time, professors, and I was only 13 or 14, that I ever pulled an all-nighter. The book was called Exodus by Leon Uris. And I still remember, to this day, it's now 60 years later, the transformational impact And I was a voracious reader, so I read just about anything. But this book stopped me dead in my tracks. I didn't know it. This was a book about essentially how Israel was reborn in 1948. But it didn't start there with the battles for survival. If you saw the movie, back to movies, David, with Paul Newman and Eva Marie Saint, it starts in Cyprus. And why does it start in Cyprus? Because even after the Second World War, even after the liberation of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Treblinka and the other camps, the Jews still lived without a dwelling place. Some tried to go back to their homes in Poland and Hungary, and they were unwelcome. The Jews are coming back to regain the property we stole from them, or retake the jobs that we displaced them from. And after the war, perhaps you know, I'm sure some of you do, there were pogroms against Jews in Kielce and Krakow and elsewhere, against the survivors of Auschwitz. And where did they go? Irony of ironies? Most went to Germany. Why Germany? Because the Allied nations had created displaced persons camps, DP camps, including at Bergen-Belsen. So what had been a Nazi concentration camp morphed into a DP camp, because while the Nazis had sought to kill the inmates and didn't quite finish the task, the survivors still had nowhere to go and felt safest under American, British, or French occupation in the western portion of Germany as opposed to the Soviet. And those Jews who tried to go to mandatory Palestine under British rule, unless they were able to enter very narrowly through the small quotas imposed by the British, or unless they were able to illegally enter, they were captured and they were sent to Cyprus. And I think some of you know the story of the ship with the name Exodus, carrying survivors who were put behind barbed wire on the island of Cyprus, which was under British rule, not Cypriot rule, British rule, and kept for years. As many as 2,000 Jewish children were born on the island of Cyprus to Holocaust survivors because they still were not given a dwelling place. That's how the book begins. And that's the story I learned because my parents didn't tell me. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't want to burden me at a young age with heavy stuff. And as my wife said yesterday, sometimes when you're ready to ask the questions, there's no one around to answer them. So I began to understand that Israel was not just another country. I began to understand that if there was not going to be a dwelling place elsewhere, then Israel was certainly to be the dwelling place. And yet, I lived in America. Wasn't that also a dwelling place? Shouldn't I be proud? And then I read my second book, which I just happened to pick off the shelves at a library. No one had recommended it. It was a book by a gentleman named Arthur Morse, entitled While 6 Million Died. And again, I remember to this day my emotional reaction because I was totally unprepared for the American side of the story. Could this be the America in which I lived, in which my parents celebrated? The America in which people like Breckinridge Long, the Assistant Secretary of State, actively prevented Jewish immigration to the United States? And by the way, we learned in 1944, because these debates are ongoing about what more America might have done, whether bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz or... In 1944, the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, a close friend and neighbor in the Hudson Valley of FDR, had finally had enough of the reports of the final solution, the Endlösung in German. By the way, parenthetically, Winston Churchill had famously said, when apprised of what was happening in Europe, it is a crime without a name. And it was not until Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer and survivor, came up with the word genocide, combining a Latin and a Greek root, that we can now use the term genocide as a customary word in our language to describe what happened. But I learned from Arthur Morse that America did very little until 1944, when it created the War Refugee Board, found Raoul Wallenberg in neutral Sweden, sent him to Budapest, and amazingly, remarkably, ingeniously, he saved thousands of Jews. Proving, perhaps, that had action been done earlier by the United States, could more Jews have been saved? And these two books, I can tell you, without an ounce of hyperbole, even though Americans generally have a PhD in hyperbole, just in the use of our language generally. The biggest, the best, the greatest. They changed my life. They changed my life and they changed my direction and they awakened me. And let me share one more story before I fast forward. When I was 10 years old, I began to feel that at night when I was supposed to be asleep, my parents in the next bedroom were talking quite animatedly. Couldn't hear them. It's a mishmash of languages. Tried to unravel them. And then I discovered what it was all about. CBS, where my father worked as an engineer, wanted to send him to Germany. Because he had been part of a series of inventions at CBS, things you all take for granted. Video replay. Someone had to found it. Sound effects, and how to incorporate them into television. So very innocently, CBS came to my father, Eric Harris, and said, "We've got a great offer for you. We want to send you and your family to Germany." 1960, 15 years after the Holocaust. My father hated Germany, Germans, German language. swore he would never ever return. My mother had never set foot in Germany, never wanted to set foot in Germany. My grandparents were in a panic that we would end up in Germany. And yet, CBS did not know of my father's history because no one spoke about it in the 1950s. He didn't speak about it. No one asked. He had an accent, but no one was interested in where he came from or what his story was. This is America. Look ahead. Don't look back. Don't bring the problems of the past to America. Don't bring the squabbles. Don't bring Europe with its endless wars to America. This is a clean slate. So what happened? Anguish in the Harris home. And finally they persuaded him to go to Germany for a few weeks alone. And if he could make it, we would come. And I remember the night, for the younger people this will sound like dinosaur history, when a person-to-person phone call via an operator. Is this Mrs. Harris? Yes, operator. I have Mr. Harris calling you from Germany. Oh, and by the way, it's collect. Will you accept the charges? That's old terminology. And I heard my mother say, yes, Eric, we will start packing. And so, on the eve of my 11th birthday, with two survivors of the Second World War who hated Germany, whose lives had been completely and totally turned upside down by Germany, who had lost relatives to Germany, we moved to Munich, where it all began, with Hitler's beer hall putsch. It all began. And in addition to the books which I read subsequently, boy, did I grow up. Why? Because 15 years after the Holocaust, if you think about it, anyone over the age of, say, 32 or 33 years old was suspect. That was a good chunk of the country. So I don't know how you were raised at the dining room table or in a restaurant, but the conversations I heard between my mother and my father were, what do you think? Wehrmacht, Einsatzgruppen, SS. This was the conversation. And then I saw my father at the central train station in Munich when we were going somewhere, see a poster. And all of a sudden, he rushes to the poster and starts to grab it. And my mother says, Eric, stop. The poster was of Dachau. But Dachau was a destination of the German train, a picturesque village just outside of Munich. And there my mother, desperately trying to pull my father back while my father says, how dare they? Eric the fighter, trying to rip down the poster. Folks, I can't speak for Larry. I don't know who else, but we're damaged goods. This is not a normal childhood. This is not a normal upbringing. But what it taught me was, first of all, Jewish pride and dignity. My parents may not have been observant Jews in the traditional sense of the term. And David, even in the Hebrew words that you used in your presentation, they would have whispered to their neighbor, what does it mean? But they were Jews. And they were damned if they were going to give in to the anti-Semites. And even though they didn't necessarily know what the 613 commandments were, or why have a Shabbat dinner, or why fast on Yom Kippur, they were going to do it because they saw no other way for themselves and for the world. And I also understood something else. Israel was not going to be just another country in my life, nor was it going to be a political hobby where I kind of veered in and out depending on who happened to be in charge. Israel was something far, far larger, because it was the ultimate destination, the dwelling place, the one little piece on earth where Jews above all could control their own destiny, and do so not in some unfamiliar land, but in a land that was historically, biblically, archaeologically, spiritually, metaphysically linked to the Jewish people since time immemorial. Had Israel existed 10 years earlier, I wouldn't even mention the Evian Conference. There would have been no need to mention the Evian Conference or to call out the United States or France or the other countries that attended and then slam their doors shut. It wouldn't have mattered, because there would have been an Israel without the Breckinridge Law and without the restrictive quotas and without the polling on whether admitting Jews would trigger more anti-Semitism or not, and lead Americans to call FDR the Jew deal rather than the New Deal. It would have been very different. That is the ultimate meaning of Israel, dear friends, for myself, and I dare say, I hope for many others. On this tiny sliver of land, exactly 1% the size of Saudi Arabia, exactly 2% the size of Egypt, 1/11 the size of Syria. And I realized as I matured in my 20s that if the world was not prepared to accept even that little tiny sliver of land for Jewish sovereignty and safety and security and destiny, then I wasn't sure I wanted to live in this world. And like the late Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate, I understood that I didn't necessarily have to live in Israel, but I couldn't live without Israel. That was the fundamental point. And I equally understood that if roughly 15 million people, of course, absent the 6 million who were lost and what would have been their progeny, could not find a safe place on the planet, not where they could be privileged and protected, but where they would experience, enjoy, equal protection, equal rights, and equal opportunity, then that too was not a world in which I wanted to live. So I entered the Jewish world having never thought about it through college. I then had not scholarly pretensions, but modest ambitions to be the American ambassador Isabella to Moscow. I spoke Russian. I was interested in the Soviet Union. So I thought one day, maybe. And I embarked on what turned out to be not just a 2-year Jewish Peace Corps experience, but a 47-year career, some of which I shared with Yehudi Barsky, some of which I shared with David Bernstein, and some of which I shared as the landlord of Charles Small and ISGAP when they were in our building. Driven by these two fundamental beliefs, that I wasn't just fighting for the Jewish people and Israel, but fighting for the kind of world that would evolve, in which there would be enough place for us as part of a larger tapestry. And if there wasn't, what kind of a world was being formed? And so I fast forward to 2000. In 2000, my wife and I and our children took a sabbatical year. By the way, another Jewish contribution to human civilization, the notion of a day of rest for all people, not Jews, for all people and for animals. A revolutionary notion, which again had to have a starting point. Until then, Slaves worked and slave owners didn't, wherever. In Egypt or wherever it may have been. And we moved to Geneva, Switzerland. Won't go into the reasons. And we saw things that were beautiful, and we saw things that appalled us. And the most important thing we saw that appalled us, and we were the first to call it out, so AJC became the first to call it out, was the rebirth of anti-Semitism in Europe in a serious way. I'm not talking about an isolated incident here or there. I'm talking about in a serious way. Because we saw it up close. Because 2 of our children experienced moments at their Geneva school. Because we saw the indifference of the school administration. Because we were close enough to France to feel, and Seema spoke about French Jewry before and their anxiety, to feel what was happening to them. Because France became the epicenter of the rebirth. And then it spread to Belgium and Germany and Sweden and other countries and eventually to Central and Eastern Europe. And so that's when we began to develop our strategy. How to deal with this. And we came up with a very simple strategy. When I say we, AJC, but the strategy was very, very simple. Number 1, anti-Semitism must not be seen as a Jewish problem to be fixed by Jews. May sound very simple. I can tell you, in the world out there, not the scholarly, ivy-towered world, that alone was a difficult proposition to get across. It was not the job of Jews to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a disease that affects non-Jews and threatens Jews, but ultimately, as the world should have learned, left unchecked metastasizes and will destroy democracy. Certainly democracy as we know it, liberal, pluralistic democracy. Number 1. Number 2, we said, if you're going to be serious about anti-Semitism, you have to be swivel-headed. Don't weaponize it. Don't instrumentalize it. Don't politicize it. If anti-Semitism comes from jihadists yelling Allahu Akbar, take it at face value. Acknowledge it. Confront it. They've actually made your life easier about motivation. If it comes from neo-Nazis brandishing swastikas and shouting, Jews will not replace us, and invoking Nazi terminology about blood and soil, acknowledge it. They're helping you. They're telling you their motivational ideology. The third of the 3 was the most difficult. And it took years and years for many European governments to come to terms with this. And in some cases, I'm not sure that every government has still come to terms with it. And that was from the far left. Now here the problem begins with the fact that the far left defines itself as anti-fascist. Hence, if I'm anti-fascist, how dare you, Jalal, accuse me of anti-Semitism? I'm the heir of the partisan movement. I'm the heir of those who took on in the resistance, in the forests, in the caves, in the underground. Your enemy, the Nazis. My enemy, our common enemy. I'm an anti-Semite. Okay. But wait, and here it gets tricky, and back to one of the centerpieces, Charles, of this seminar. And that is, but you have a problem. And your problem is that there are 193 member states of the United Nations. And you seem to have no difficulty with 192 of them. Or if you do, it's temporary, it's very specific to an issue or a particular leader. But when it comes to legitimacy, existence, you have a problem with just one: Israel. Why? If we're talking through the filter of legitimacy, may I ask you, dear friends of the far left, what exactly is the legitimacy of the United States, of Canada, of Australia, of New Zealand? What explains the fact that in all of our travels to Latin America, until Alejandro Toledo became the president of Peru, we did not meet one single Latin American leader with an indigenous background? Not one. Not one. They were all proud of their Italian and Spanish and Basque and French backgrounds. And dear friends of the far left, since you're so enamored with Israel's enemies, pray tell, since legitimacy is at the center of your organization of the world, what's the legitimacy of Jordan? What's the legitimacy of Iraq? Why, as my wife discussed yesterday in conversation, Jalal, with you, why is the word Arab attached to countries in North Africa that have no relationship to Arab people? But you have only this one problem. So what else is going on there? You want to give me all these epithets that Isabella recounted for us? They bounce right off me. My response, at least the response I would wish to give, is the middle finger. I may be more polite depending on the company, but down deep it's a primal scream that says, F you. You've taken everything else away from us. Maybe Hitler and Stalin gave anti-Semitism a bad name in your universe of the far left. So we're going to find the linguistic camouflage, because we don't want to be compared to Hitler and Stalin's policies. And there it is, on a silver platter, anti-Zionism. And it comes with a linguistic formula. David, before I tell you what I think about Israel, I want to assure you, some of my best professors were Jewish. Some of my best friends were Jewish. Some of my dorm roommates were Jewish. But folks, again, I don't come with the scholarly presentation and the dozens of footnote citations. But sometimes, as was famously said about pornography in the Supreme Court, you know it when you see it. You know it when you see it. The footnotes help, the scholarly papers help. But folks, when one country on earth, comprising, Lord knows, 0.0001% of the world's territory and population, triggers this kind of 24/7 global multi-billion-dollar industry, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. So that's what we told our European friends. Call it out. And some did, and others hesitated, and some weaponized. And when there was a right-wing government, they would point to the left, and when there was a left-wing government, they'd point to the right. And we kept insisting the key word here is swivel-headed. And that brings me to the end, and where we are today, and what I think still needs to be done. Maybe, in a sense, and again, I don't have the full sweep of history or the scholarly credentials, but Jews had historically found several ways to try and grapple with this situation of the lack of a dwelling place, or if they had a tent set up, the lack of permanence and certainty. They pretty much tried everything. They tried to hide. They tried to lay low. They tried to go along. They tried to accommodate. Some tried to convert, change their names, vanish. But the real first Pfizer vaccine, if you will, for Jews, I think, was the Enlightenment. Something fundamentally changed in Europe, beginning at the end of the 18th century, and starting, yes, in France and the Netherlands. And maybe the Enlightenment would be the answer. But then along came a largely secular journalist named Theodor Herzl. Again, perhaps an improbable hero of the Jewish people, who saw that even with the Enlightenment and even with all the alleged steps taken to emancipate the Jews, anti-Semitism couldn't and wouldn't be eradicated, not in the Austro-Hungarian Empire where he had grown up, and not in the most advanced of the nations, France, where he, as a journalist, covered the Dreyfus trial. And that's when he came to his conclusion. Enlightenment seemed so promising. We thought we were so close. Maybe this was it. After centuries, millennia, we were there. And no, we weren't. And then perhaps the second Pfizer vaccine for some Jews came along. And let's call it universalism. Some might more specifically call it Marxism. Isabella, what a tantalizing message. The brotherhood of nationalities, the universality of the cause, the lack of distinction between and among peoples. We are all one. And after the Tsarist period, and after the pogroms, and after the Cossacks, and after the Black Hundreds, and all the rest, people were so hungry, so desperate. Whether it sounded exactly right, but maybe. Only to discover that that wasn't the answer either, because at the end of the day, Trotsky was still Bronstein. A very famous quote. For those of you who don't know what I'm referring to, Leon Trotsky, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution until he was exiled to Mexico, where he was killed by Stalin's henchmen, was born Bronstein. And at the end of the day, Trotsky could change his name. He could proclaim in front of thousands universality of communism and Marxism, Leninism, and the workers' struggle. But at the end of the day, Trotsky was Bronstein. That's it. And then came the third Pfizer vaccine, the one that, whether you thought of it in these terms or not, we've experienced. Liberal democracy. Liberal democracy. Could this finally be that Pfizer vaccine? Where even if these societies were imperfect, and we discussed those imperfections just a few hours ago, David, in your session and elsewhere, but nonetheless, at least seen from a Jewish vantage point, and through the prism of the history that Jews bring to the table, this either blessing or curse or both of memory. We had seen it all, and this was by far the most promising. Liberal democracy. A level playing field. We all play by the same rules. Maybe we don't quite reach the vision of B'Tselem Elohim, that we're all created in the image of God and view each other as being created in the image of God. We're not quite there yet, but we're a lot closer than the Soviet Union was, or Nazi Germany was, or Napoleon's France was, or our experience in the Arab world was. We were close. And then, as Seema said, this explosion, not just in Europe, but across the border, across the water, and here we are. And in a way, much as I miss my parents, my mother especially, I'm almost happy she's not alive today. I don't know how she could deal with this. In the early 2000s, when she was still alive, and when France began to explode and Jews wondered whether they had a future, and the chief rabbi of France said, you're permitted to wear a baseball cap or even to remove your kippah because it's too dangerous on the streets. And the words mort aux juifs, death to the Jews, was being shouted in Toulouse and in Paris and in Lille. And my mother was still alive. She trembled. And she looked beyond me. She looked to our grandchildren, her grandchildren. And she said, what future awaits them? And now she would have had great-grandchildren. And one of those great-grandchildren, the oldest, is named Mila. Mila is a beautiful name that comes from Slavic. But Mila was the name of my cousin, Mila Racine, who during the Second World War, at the age of 21, began smuggling Jewish children from Haute-Savoie in southeastern France across the border to Switzerland. And she rescued 236 Jewish children before being caught by the Nazis. And she was killed in Mauthausen 6 weeks before the end of the war. Our son Danny and his wife Noga chose to name their first child Mila. And not just because it was a beautiful name, because they come from fighters. And their answer to a world which still cannot fully accept 15 million Jews and one tiny sliver of land is, we're putting a mezuzah on our door, we're naming our daughter Mila. When she's old enough, she will know the story. We're here to stay, and if necessary, we're here to fight.
What to say? Thank you, David. It's a brilliant presentation at many levels, so thank you. I don't know what to say. Comments?
Yashiko.
Yeah. Thank you. John.
In 2004, Natan Sharansky convened the conference in Jerusalem to get all the Jewish organizations and maybe non-Jewish organizations to fight anti-Semitism. You were there. I was there in the 5th row. I mean, I was not that important to be in the 3rd row.
Who counts rows?
Well, I count the row. I saw you in the 1st row. You should have been there. I mean,
Apologies.
no, it was your place. No, it was your place. With all the big shots there. Okay. Anyway, I was part of the Latin American group there, and I coined a phrase that reads, for the first time in recent history, we have government-sponsored anti-Semitism in a Western country. I was talking about my country, about Venezuela.
Yeah.
People say you're crazy. In a Western country, anti-Semitism, government, it cannot happen. It was happening, and it did happen. And when it happened, when they raided our school and they raided our synagogue, people like David Harris showed up. He showed up. We're a small community. I mean, why do we need an important big guy, to come and be with us? Well, that's what gave us strength. Somebody came to stand with us, and it helped at that moment. I mean, my community is basically decimated now, but at that time, it was important to us to see somebody like David standing there with us. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to say, to follow up on that, for those of you who don't know, David is an absolutely legendary legendary figure for many, many Jews across the world. You hear about David in Poland. I mean, I'm deeply grateful to David for everything that he did for Soviet Jews. Just so you know, this is an extraordinary person that we're hearing from today. And I want to thank you for your story, and I want to point out that, you know, we spoke yesterday a little bit about how it's not enough to just present figures and correct untruths kind of on a factual level in order to fight anti-Semitism. This is an example of how you touch people's hearts and how we need to be telling stories like this, right? There are a lot of stories to be told, and we need to do that much more actively than I think we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you as well.
Can I just follow up on that, because I just want to thank you first of all for this. It was beautiful. But what was so effective also is that, you know, you really modeled what, and I'm sorry to keep mentioning Jesuits, what like in Jesuit pedagogy is called the pastoral circle, which is like you start with the story, with the encounter, but then you bring in like the facts and the larger situation and invite people to reflect on that and then call for action. And you did this beautiful circle where you like fleshed out, like you drew us in with this story and then you fleshed it out with this larger significance. And I feel like we're all like ready to walk out. I don't want to speak for my president, but I'm ready to walk out of the room, right, and feel inspired. So I just want to thank you for that part for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're
No,
my
no, no.
hero. Yes.
Let's get to debate and and argument and
So I actually have
and pushback.
I have a question, not a pushback, but I don't have a story to tell. I could tell the story of my family, but for someone like me who doesn't have a story to tell, how do I influence the conversation in a way that's going to make a difference?
Linda, I mean, first of all, if I knew the real answer, then we'd be way ahead in the game right now. But from my experience, at least, these 47 years in thousands of different situations, I think that we have to learn a few things. When I say we, I'm not talking about Jews. I'm talking about all the people who believe in fighting for a just, fair, equitable, open, mutually respectful society. Because, as I said on another occasion here in the ISGAP seminar, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. My wife yesterday said, first they came for the Jews, and when there were no Jews, they came for the Christians in Libya. And I had mentioned in my own intervention the other day, Charles, that had there been a synagogue next to the AME church in Charleston, you can be darn certain that that would have been the next target, and I added the mosque would have been the third, given the chance. So we're all in this together. But the first thing I've tried to learn, Linda, is situational awareness. And forgive me, with great respect to all the scholars here, at least in my own educational experience, no one, damn it, taught me situational awareness. How to assess a moment in time. You're with one person, you're with a group of people, there are bystanders, there are not bystanders, you're in a public space, you're in a private space. But you have, I think, one has to develop certain tools of situational awareness. For instance, if the person that troubles you, Linda, is a raving anti-Semite or anti-Zionist, both, all the above, racist, as far as I'm concerned, either punch him in the mouth or walk away. But there's nothing in between.
Or both.
Well, you know, if he's way bigger than you are, think twice. I mean, let's also be pragmatic here. Let's not, go down in flames. But what I'm saying is, for him, I'm saying him, it could be her, whatever. But for him, your engagement only fuels his juices. You're not going to change his mind. Why give him that extra moment, that extra attention, that extra pleasure, if you will? Walk away. Or, Linda, if he's ranting at you and there are third parties who happen to be watching because it's on a street, for some reason he thinks you're Jewish, let's say, or you're wearing a Star of David or whatever, coming out of a synagogue, and a group of people kind of feel that there's a street theater about to unfold and they gather around, then maybe you don't just walk away. Maybe you think about not how you talk to him, but how you say something that will resonate with the group. I don't want to embarrass my wife. I actually slept in bed last night, for those of you who were wondering if it would be the couch, the floor, or the bed. But I need to tell you a story about my wife in answer to your question as well, Linda. We were in London toward the end of our year in Geneva. We came for a weekend with our kids, just for fun. And it was a Sunday, and there was, I think it was a Sunday too, and there was near Speaker's Corner, there was a gathering, and there was someone speaking about us. And we were on the edge. We had two of our children with us. At the time, I think one was 18 and one was 14. And the speaker, who was Arab, said the following to a couple of hundred people, and we heard it.
In English.
In English, thank you, in English. Folks, what's the difference between a Jew and a pizza? And then he paused for theatrical effect, and then he said, they both go into the ovens, but at least the pizza doesn't make noise.
Where was this?
London, England,
But at what event?
Speaker's Corner,
Speaker's Corner.
Hyde Park,
Might explain Speaker's Corner to people who don't all know.
couple of hundred people. This is the ultimate expression of free speech, and people bring a soapbox, and anyone can stand up and anyone can say whatever they want.
Except I'm gonna kill the sovereign.
Okay. Well,
That's true.
but
That's one thing they're not.
but as you hear, you can say we want to kill the Jews. Now, in this case, Linda, speaking about situational awareness, my first instinct was, what would the impact of this be on our children? But the hero of the story is sitting right there. And the next thing I know, my wife is not with us, and I don't know where she is. This 5'2", and she makes me add the half, 2.5-inch firebrand went right up on the stage.
Wow, nice.
Right up on the stage in front of a couple of hundred people, and went right up into his face. There's no ounce of exaggeration here. And she gave him a piece of her mind. In Arabic, I was about to say. And he was so taken aback because the other couple of hundred people laughed. Wasn't that a great joke about the pizza? Gee, I hadn't known that. Right up into his face in Arabic. And she's a woman. I mean, you have to add that into the moment. She's a woman. And she's unafraid. There was no show of fear. It was not, oh, mister, would you please talk nicely about the Jews? Because, after all, we created the polio vaccine, and you should really be kind to us. It was, in this moment, the only thing you understand is your own language. And then she came down. And as she walked back toward us, and by the way, we were trembling because we didn't know what would happen next. And there was a tall, sort of classic Anglo, probably a graduate of one of these places, blonde, tall, angular. And as she walked to go past him toward us, he looked at her and he said, F the Jews.
What?
F the Jews. So what I'm saying, Linda, is there are moments to walk away. There are moments to stand up, if only for your own sense of dignity. And there are also moments when you can teach people around you how to handle. And I'll just give you one other illustration. I was at a liberal arts college some years ago, meeting with students and talking about the Middle East. And they were great, except for one student. I think his name was Daniel. And every few minutes he'd raise his hand. I'd say, Mr. Harris, Mr. Harris. And he asked me some challenging question on Israel. Why does Israel kill all left-handed people on Tuesdays? Whatever. And I thought, you know what? I need to stay calm, I need to stay cool, I need to stay composed. He's not getting under my skin. I'm not going to let the other students see that he's a real pain, as we say, we Jews, pain in the tuchus, which if you don't know the word means pain in the derriere. And he went on like this, probably with about 8 or 10 interruptions, Linda. And then when I realized where he was coming from, and mindful not of him, but of the students around him, who had been quiet until that point, I said, Daniel, you've asked me a lot of questions. May I ask you just one question? Just one. And he gave me this kind of macho, yeah, man, come, bring it on, man. You know, like, yeah, there's nothing you can do to me, right? And I said, Daniel, tell me, under any circumstances, any borders, do you believe that Israel has the right to exist? There was total silence. And the students understood in that moment, this was about 15 years ago, that even if they didn't like the Israeli government of the day, even if they, whether they were smart or not, you know, invoke terms like a two-state solution or end the settlements, whatever, fine, fine. Those are debates you heard from SEMA. Those are legitimate debates. But the moment they heard that what he really meant was under no circumstance does Israel have any right to exist, they weren't ready for that. Now, maybe 15 years later, some students are more ready for it, but they weren't. So I would expose, where appropriate, people, I'd expose them. So again, situational awareness. Please.
Carolyn.
Thank you very much. It was impressive, and I think both of you are just like brought really outstanding stories and created, I don't know, humanity or an actual voice. I wanted to say just 2 comments. One, supporting what you brought. And maybe Linda, to you too. I work with someone that used to be the dean, or maybe she's still the dean of students in my university. And it took a while for her to come and like secretly tell me that she's actually Jewish. She didn't tell anyone. And she told me my grandparents, I think it was the 30s or 40s, living in, I think, around New York or in New York, realized that there was so much anti-Semitism that they moved to a different state, changed their last name, stopped going to synagogues, and raised their daughter, that was at the time 7 or 8 years old, still remembering she's Jewish, with no religion. And she said, I was born to that mother that never agreed, that never told me I'm Jewish, and never agreed to this. And she told me, even if I have Jewish heritage, I don't feel Jewish because I don't know anything about Jewish and about Jewish world and culture, and I have no story to tell, like all of you. And she looked at me and some other people or talked about us, you have stories to tell, and I have no story to tell. And I think this is a story too. When we don't have stories, this is also a story to tell. So this is just to raise up some awareness when we don't have stories. But I think we all hear stories, and I think we got to an age also now that we're talking about second generation Holocaust survivors, and you're getting into third and fourth. We're all getting into a place where second-hand stories are good enough to see. I saw a person, I heard that story, and this is a story too. So I wanted to say this and to open up understandings of stories. Another thing is that I hear a lot, I think like in the US, at least in the US, you cannot talk about racism without bringing the history of racism in the US. But we tend to talk a lot about contemporary anti-Semitism without bringing anti-Semitism in the US. And I think we touched just a little bit here, but US suffered badly from anti-Semitism.
That's fine.
In the 30s and
Yeah.
40s, Jews were attacked in Boston and New York in the streets, and like Jewish militia needed to be raised in order to protect Jews just wanting to walk by the streets. Father Coughlin at the time
Yeah.
recruited a lot of people. So we are dealing with harsh anti-Semitism in the US, and I think we don't talk enough about it. So if people want, I don't know, resources or things to rely on teaching, I think this is one of the things. And I wanted to say that the US did not agree to bomb Auschwitz, and this was also one of the, I think, the huge failure, bombing everywhere else and not wanting to bomb Auschwitz, that could save many people's lives.
The rail lines to Auschwitz. So let me just add, Carolyn, thank you. And it prompts another thought, really both your and Linda's interventions. For me, when I speak publicly or to other groups who, for example, may roll their eyes if I invoke the Holocaust, here we go again, another tale of Jewish suffering and self-involvement, and why can't they get over it? I think there are more universal lessons of World War II that are absolutely applicable today, August 16th, 2023. And whether we have individual stories to tell, for example, about World War II or not, I think we need to embrace them and we need to share them. Number one, directly to this group. Joseph Goebbels, I'm sure most of you know the name, back to the word propaganda, whoever raised it yesterday. The master propagandist of the Nazi regime, Joseph Goebbels, had a PhD from one of the world's great universities, the University of Heidelberg. And his PhD was not in Nazi ideology or extermination of Jews. It was in dramatic arts. Niall Ferguson, the Stanford historian, in one of the books he wrote, spoke about the fact that the Einsatzgruppen, who were the killing squads in Eastern Europe that massacred Jews in Babi Yar, if you've heard of Babi Yar, near Kiev, and elsewhere along the Seam, S-E-A-M. He says that more than 50% of the commanders in the Einsatzgruppen had a PhD. So when we talk about antidotes to anti-Semitism and racism, and we invoke the word education because it's the right word, we can't stop there. It's too cheap and easy. We have to, in a way, deconstruct the word, if that's permitted, in order to understand what does it really mean in these circumstances. How can lessons be conveyed in the year 2023 when this kind of history, whether it's the civil rights struggle of the 1960s or whether it's the Holocaust, seems like ancient history and triggers a roll of the eyes because, at least in America today, history is irrelevant. History is perhaps what I had for breakfast this morning. Barely. And where my attention span has been reduced largely to a nanosecond, and you want me to tell stories? Stories? When I may have the attention. Earlier, I think, David, you were asked about 30 seconds. To me, when I heard 30 seconds, I thought, wow, that's a gift. You might have to make the sale in the first 10 seconds, 15 seconds. So how does one do this? So education does not guarantee safety, security, equality, peace, harmony. Number two, The lesson of the Second World War for me includes a failure of imagination. Hitler did not hide his agenda. Hitler spelled it out. In that sense, please understand me, he did us a favor. He was in the Landsberg prison in 1924, and he used the occasion to write Mein Kampf, My Struggle. He spelled it out in excruciatingly painful detail. 9 years later, on January 30th, 1933, Hitler came to power as chancellor, and 2 months later, with the enabling legislation, took full control. And I shouldn't say all, but most of the great experts and scholars and academicians and politicians and think tank folks, if they dusted off Mein Kampf, gave it short shrift. And they invoked old political science theories like governance moderates. After all, if you can't deliver the mail or pick up the garbage, you're not long for office. Or we'd add in New York, or shovel the snow. John Lindsay discovered that in the 60s. Okay. Failure of imagination. And the few people like Winston Churchill who understood Hitler from the beginning and who called him out were shunned. Churchill's book was entitled In the Wilderness, very aptly. The third thing, which again, Linda, whether you have a story or not, or Carolyn, democracy is fragile. I don't think most people in democratic countries, at least until recently in the United States, understood that. They simply assumed that what is, was, and what is, will be. Fact of life. Take it for granted. Occasionally an immigrant will come along like my wife and say, Americans, wake up. Because only if you have experienced the absence of democracy, vote, voice, can you understand, however imperfect, the precious gift you have and should defend. There was democracy in Germany. From 1919 to 1933, the Weimar Republic, messy, chaotic as it was a democracy on steroids. I mean, communists battling fascists and everything in between, a sexual revolution, all of it. And it crumbled like a house of cards. Like a house of cards. So, and the fourth and final lesson is appeasement doesn't work. Obviously, in international relations and diplomacy, war is not the first, it should be the last option. It should be the reluctant option. And first there should be an attempt to speak, to dialogue, to negotiate, to explore quietly, track one, track two, in third countries, go down the list of the toolbox. But that wasn't, at the end of the day, what the Western world did with Germany. Germany was appeased. And the British and French thinking, but led by the British, was, you know it. At the end of the day, give them the Sudetenland. Give them. And Hitler, said Chamberlain, looked in my eyes and said to me, that's their only priority is Czechoslovakia. And then they'll be satisfied. And it'll be over. And elsewhere, and I'm misquoting, Chamberlain essentially said, and who in Britain gives a damn about Sudeten or Czech or Slovak folks 1,000 miles away? So you don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to be a veteran of World War II. You don't have to be a child of survivors of the Holocaust in order, I think, to be able to make the kinds of interventions which are completely relevant to 2023, because education, Does that ensure that someone does not become an anti-Semite or a racist? We hope it helps to prevent. But foolproof? No way, Jose. Right? Protection of democracy? Well, we've got a couple of court cases going on in the United States right now, and we've seen other challenges to democracy in various countries, and as was said, was it by you, Charles? That some close to 50% of French voters, who said that in their intervention? Huh? Oh, then I'll say it. In the first round of presidential politics in France, voted for extremist candidates of the far left and the far right. I can keep going. So it's all relevant, and if we're not going to play that megaphone role, I don't know who will. And if you'll just allow me as we go to lunch, and I don't say this gratuitously, I'm not running for office, I'm not asking for votes, not asking for money. I am deeply moved, more than I can express, as a Jew with the history that I've shared with you in part, that there are some 45 of you, Jews and non-Jews from around the world, who would take 2 weeks out of your busy lives, which could either be spent on your career or your family or on vacation or elsewhere, in a classroom from morning till night, talking about these issues and working together to say not only how can we better understand them, but how can we more effectively fight them. And for some of us Jews who live with this sort of damaged quality and this kind of lingering generational trauma, I'm going into Larry's area again, this fear of being alone is enduring. No matter how successful Jews may look to you from the outside, no matter what degrees we come to the table with from whatever universities, no matter where we live, I can't speak for all Jews, that's dangerous. But I can speak for some Jews. There's a profound sense of vulnerability that we carry from generation to generation. So more than you may realize, you're here to learn and to develop your own courses and to teach, but you've also achieved something else. I think you've made people like me feel a little bit less alone.
So, should we go on 5 more minutes? Or should we end it on this poetic note? Okay.
Wow.
So there's a lot to go on. I'm gonna, Carlton, and then I'm gonna say something, and then we're gonna go for lunch. Carlton,
Just very
Yeah.
quickly, thank you a million times, Dave, for a wonderful, powerful exposition. Just so important. Thank you. And thank you also for the phrase. I mean, it's a good organizational tool to think about situational awareness on so many levels. Because I think that it responds a bit to Linda's statement, because we all have some kind of connection to the past, which is painful, and sometimes we just have to dig into our own people, places, and things in order to connect more deeply and then articulate that. So that's what I found in my own kind of oral history of my family. But finally, just the education piece. Thank you. Because so often, especially in places like Oxford and elsewhere, we tend to think that there's just formal education, which prepares one, but the moral instruction, the ethical instruction that you get at your mommy's knee or daddy's knee, that carries you through the world. This other stuff is fluff. At best, it just gives you a diploma that indicates that you've been someplace.
So thank you, Carl. I want to carry on this. So to challenge you a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. You can make the argument, like during the Nazi time, where scholars and intellectuals and philosophers were at the forefront, and scientists were at the forefront of Nazism. You can make the argument that the great intellectuals of the contemporary moment are at the forefront, the front line of the war against the Jewish people. They're laying the intellectual foundations for the annihilation of Israel. And it's being taught. It's being taught at our best universities. So that's number one. During the Holocaust, universities were the only institution in Nazi Germany that voluntarily gave up its Jews. Not the police, not the unions, the universities gave up its Jews voluntarily, forced their colleagues out, and the students out, and the faculty members out. Second point, as we're here in the last 2 weeks, the Biden administration is transferring billions of dollars to a state that supports state-sponsored anti-Semitism, that calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, that spends a lot of its time, energy, and resources in propaganda and in supporting proxy wars against the Jewish people. The United States is aiding and abetting, as you were saying about Hitler, a state that calls openly and consistently and clearly and based on its ideology for the elimination of the Jewish people. So how can it be in 2023? It started with the Obama administration and it's continuing with the Biden administration. How can this be on the Jerusalem on the Hill, in which I've also become a citizen quite recently? How is this possible? That our education, our best universities, and the leading democratic country is doing this?
Well,
In 30 seconds.
Since he's my boss, I can't kick him under the table because it's a huge question. It's the end of the session. Lunch is waiting. I think we're already running late. And it's a question I hope we can return to. I don't want to evade the question. Look, Neville Chamberlain was not an evil man, if I may say so, Charles. At least, obviously I never met him, but from everything I read, the British Prime Minister who negotiated what he thought was the deal with Hitler in September 1938, he was not an evil man. He was not Khamenei. He was a decent man. By the way, so much so that when Churchill took office on May 10th, 1940, he insisted that Chamberlain be part of his cabinet. In other words, even though Chamberlain had been the appeaser that Churchill had ridiculed, he brought him into the cabinet. He understood his decency and also, I guess, his political worth. So I think here the beginning of the answer is not that the Washington administrations are somehow evil or wish to be complicit in evil. I don't believe that for a moment, and I suspect you don't either. But they've bought a narrative which within it is kind of tightly knit. In other words, if you don't come from the outside and puncture it, you know, it has its own internal logic. We don't want to go to war with Iran. It will be a devastating conflagration throughout the region. It will trigger sub-wars. We have just left Afghanistan. We have been in Iraq. So we need to avoid war. And to avoid war, what are the options? And what I don't know, Charles, let's speak of this administration, is whether this administration has or invites naysayers. I always welcomed at AJC, and by the way, even when I didn't welcome it, I got it anyway. I like smart people. I admire smart people. I want smart people to speak and to offer their views. And I want us to have a vigorous discussion and debate. And, you know, ultimately there's one decision maker, and sometimes you're right and sometimes you're not right. But I don't know within the administration today, and I say this out of ignorance, if I were to map it, is there the naysayer who says, slow down, folks, exactly what you said, Charles? I don't know. I hope there is. I hope there is. If there's not, there should be. And if not, we may pay a price. We may pay a price. But I want to end on are we ending now? So
Yeah,
I need
yeah.
to end on a happy note because I'm not ending on
Today's
Iran
point.
wants to destroy us. I want to end on at least an uplifting note, which to me is a model for how one responds in these times, at least on the individual and group or NGO level. Some of you recall that in the late 90s, the leader of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, unleashed a genocidal war against Kosovo, which is overwhelmingly Muslim, with a small Serbian population. And as a result, he drove out hundreds of thousands of Kosovars, again, mostly Muslims, to neighboring countries, to Montenegro, to Albania, to North Macedonia. And we, at the time at AJC, wanted to show our compassion. Well, in most cases these days, compassion means I'm going to do a tweet in which I convey my thoughts and prayers. Enough of thoughts and prayers. They do nothing other than make people feel good about themselves. You know, did that, check the box, I can move on. So we decided that we would take a plane and go to visit the refugee camps. And we went to North Macedonia and we visited several refugee camps, simply to meet the people, hear their stories, show them, Sammy, that they were not alone. And the most impressive camp of all was actually run by the German Bundeswehr, the German military. And when we left, we said to ourselves, okay, what next? Because basically what we did was one step more than thoughts and prayers. I'll call it compassion tourism. Wasn't good enough. So we came up with an idea. What if instead of going back to the States, we now fly to Germany and we go speak to our friend Joschka Fischer, who was the foreign minister of Germany at the time, and we propose to Joschka Fischer, representing the German government 50 years after the Second World War, that Jews partner with Germans in uniform, the Bundeswehr, to bring help to Muslims in refugee camps. And the German government agreed. And the result of that was that we, Jews, AJC, raised several $1 million, which was used to buy materiel, blankets, tents, toys, medicines, things that were needed, that were flown on German Air Force planes to help Muslim refugees. I tell that story not to pat ourselves on the back, but because I think it's at least one answer, because people inevitably say, well, I agree with you, but what can I do? At some level, each of us can do something in the classroom, out of the classroom, in the church, in the mosque, in the synagogue, in the political arena, in the media. Now, thanks to social media, people can organize their own campaigns, which was inconceivable years ago. But we need sparks of light. We need sparks of hope for your sake and, frankly, for our grandchildren's sake.
David, thank you so much. It's really wise words. People, you have to go to the dining hall immediately because at 1:30 they